Hello, everyone. Good evening. My name is Humberto Moro, and I'm Deputy Director of Program here at DIA. And it is an honor to introduce tonight's event, the launch and discussion of the Torrington Project, a book that reflects on Tom Burr's formative work in the town Torrington, Connecticut, and explores broader questions of space, memory, and artistic legacy. Tom Burr is a conceptual artist whose practice examines the intersections of architecture, identity, and public space. Emerging in the 1990s through the influential gallery American Fine Arts, Burr became known for reworking strategies of minimalism and institutional critique, infusing them with autobiography, queer politics, and the textures of urban life. Graduate of the Whitney Independent Study Program, his work spans sculpture, installation, writing, and site-specific projects. And his work is held in major museum collections worldwide. Burr continues to live both in New York and Connecticut, and it was in Connecticut that the Torrington Project was conceived. From 2021 to 2024, Burr took up residence in a former manufacturing facility. Neither a conventional exhibition nor a traditional studio, the project transformed this space into what Burr has described as a living archive, a site for revisiting, recontextualizing, and in some cases, restoring past works. The resulting publication, the Torrington Project, is a layered, multifaceted book, a part artist book, part catalog, part archive. It documents Burr's 3-year occupation of a repurposed 19th century factory, collapsing boundaries between studio and gallery, past and present, artists and community. With over 90 works, performances, and interventions revisited in the space, and contributions from fellow artists and writers, the publication extends the project's inquiry into memory, architecture, and social exchange between its original site. Tonight, we'll hear from Tom himself, who will speak about the project and his experience. And following that, I'll moderate a conversation with the book's editor, Blake Oetting, artist Aria Dean, DIA curator Jordan Carter, each of whom has brought valuable insight and perspective to this publication. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge Kim Golding and Max Tanon, who run all public programs at DIA Chelsea. And I also want to thank Matthew Walker and James Hoff from Primary Information, the publishers of the book, for their collaboration and generosity throughout this process. And finally, a quick reminder, we'll have a book signing after the conversation concludes. Thank you so much, and please join in welcoming Tom Burr.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming to listen to us tonight. I want to thank you, Humberto Moro, for extending this very generous invitation to us to launch publicly the Torrington Project book here tonight. I also want to just say a huge thank you to Blake Oetting, Jordan Carter, Aria Dean, and Humberto for participating tonight in this conversation. Each one of these people that I just mentioned have contributed a text to this book, exquisite texts. I was very lucky when Blake and I, who is the editor on the project, sourced various possibilities of people who could intersect with this project. We never dreamt that the text would be so meaningful, so powerful. Alongside the 8 texts, 9 with Blake's editor's text, there was a 10th text, one that was, I think, in my mind, perhaps a little less concise, a little more rambling, and a little clunkier, and that was my text that rambles sort of aimlessly through the entire publication. It's quite long, and to accommodate it, we reduced the size of the text to the stature of a footnote. So it's something of a whisper that continues through the whole book, which I'm comfortable with. So I thought rather than talking ad lib about the project, I would simply select 10 fragments from that text that I wrote to read to you tonight to provide some sort of a personal context to the book. I wanted to find space, to find a physical place to make and arrange work that had a vastness to it, a sort of boundlessness, yet still with clear boundaries in place. Physical, architectural boundaries, but also temporal limitations. I didn't want this to go on indefinitely. I wanted to find a space that could operate on multiple levels at once, to play with my own and others' notions of a studio and what that could possibly mean, and give that space, that studio, a past, a present, and a future tense. It needed to look backward and forward, backward to what I've done and to what some others have done before me, and forward to speculate and to imagine, to dream a little bit even. But I also wanted to delve deeply into the present, my own physical present, and to feel seemingly endless hours and days pass through me as slowly as possible. It felt to me that this issue of speed and of slowness was particularly key in discovering certain things about how I work and also why I work, which was nagging at me and couldn't be examined in the sort of operational rush of deadlines and commitments I found myself in, one where time trudges on all around, creating its own momentum, not listening or pausing or ever drawing a blank, answering noise with noise. I visited the building at 535 Midgeon Avenue a couple of times, initially dismissing it as all too romantic and familiar. It was a 19th century warehouse building, reminiscent of Soho or Marfa or Dia Beacon, or endless artist studios located in the empty shells of past industrial economies, with artists unconsciously residing there, neither reflecting on the conflation of past and present roles, nor making much of that relationship in their work. At about this time, I started to create an inventory of works that could become part of the project, past works in particular that had been damaged or dismantled and would need to be remade on site. The first of these, Container 123, is a work from 2001 that had been exhibited once in an exhibition in Berlin, and then a part of it was shown in Berlin at some art fair some months later, and then the entire work was dismantled shortly after that. Container 123 takes on the form of Donald Judd's concrete works installed at Marfa in the grassy fields just beyond the former military buildings that Judd transformed into exhibition halls. Recalling the specific elements of that story started to matter to me, and the idea of bringing my work, which is something of an impersonation of Judd's, indoors and into this particular sort of space as a container, one that reverberates with this Soho Marfa beacon typology, began to feel like the right move. It made sense to me and to the work itself, so the stage was set based on this one work as an anchor. The project was born of different registers of emotions and distinct goals that emanated from those feelings. There were also problems I wanted to solve if possible, logistical problems of shipping and storage that had led to works being considered dead weight and too much to maintain. There was anxiety I wanted to shift up and out of itself. There were past works I wanted to revisit and re-present to the world, works that had been lost or destroyed or packed away for years, lodged in my storage or the storage of the galleries I work with. I wanted particular works to see the light of day again, and I wanted to mess with the logic of their chronology. 1993 next to 2001, across from 2010, just beyond 1988. To produce a dizzying series of associations. I also wanted to make new work from within the space of my older work. That part was about pleasure, about restructuring more pleasure into my work patterns and practices as a way of navigating forward while continuously glancing backwards. The settings that I make my work in have always been shifting, and I like to work and live largely under the radar. I don't like studio visits. I don't think I believe in them, not as they are currently set up and accepted. They work, they function too well, in fact, but not necessarily for the full benefit of artists. There's a kind of rote dumbness to it all, a dog and pony show, an awkward, largely insincere spectacle that leaves me empty and longing. Colin used to tell inquiring curators and collectors that I was the sort of artist who has meetings in bars, clubs, and cafes. I liked that then, and I like it now. And I mourn the disappearance of most of those spaces, though I still have one or two that I depend on. Torrington Project faced these irritations and frustrations head on and turned them, I think, into a work. Seen from just one perspective, Torrington Project was one long durational studio visit, 3 years plus, exhausting and exhilarating both, but probably never to be repeated, at least not in this way. I think the story of Torrington goes back decades, as many as I've lived. There are memories of the many spaces I created when I was a kid, and then as a teenager, both actual and imagined, spaces that were, I think, elaborations of the need for safety and for protection, but also a form of grafting myself onto and into structures and spaces as a way to present myself to others. For many years, I chose to remove myself from my work, conspicuously avoiding any reference to me or my biography. There was a de facto identification that happened anyway, because I was dealing in part with differentiated subjectivity, with queerness in the work. I knew that I would be read into the work already, and that I couldn't escape it, and this proved true. I consciously reduced my present and personal footprint in the work at a moment when there were steep demands and desires in the art orbit to locate and secure identity and to traffic in it. Later, I shifted somewhat so as to consciously devise ways to expose myself or some suggestion of myself as a reaction to what I saw as being categorized within the mythically anonymized zone of conceptual art that I had wanted to break from. The drawings wall was an extension of this thinking, a sort of highly personal punctuation within the overall tableau of Torrington, but one that, given the nature of the many drawings as working drawings that were sent to galleries, fabricators, and institutions, still situated me within a network of complex external forces. I imagine there could be a motivational charge and a playfulness in working within an archive, where I could be continuously prompted by the ideas floating around the space. Sometimes I can't remember the complete concrete presence of my work when I'm not in front of it, not completely. It can fall flat in my mind, and I can miss all the spatial elements. A big part of what I longed for was the idea of lingering in an exhibition setting after hours, of being able to dance through the space mentally, physically too, unencumbered by the trappings of installation, openings, tours, talks, etc. To be outside of that sort of time restriction and to be able to experience the works and the spaces between the works and around the works and over an extended period of time, luxuriating in that suspension. I wanted to create the possibility for these encounters. Claire recently shared with me a thought she had, which somehow I hadn't thought about so clearly, which connects to all this and to the shift I made in designing this project in Torrington. She referred to the idea of hosting, and that for so long throughout my working life, in fact, I had been hosted by institutions or art spaces, galleries, etc., invited to a particular location, and that invitation had been the structural backbone of my work, prompting my response. This project reversed those terms, and I became the host. I became more anchored in place. The pandemic and other reasons too determined this to some degree, but I also wanted to feel grounded in this space and to have others periodically come to me in the form of a role reversal. I wanted the structural shift of it to occur, to experience that reversal as refusal. Torrington Project had in its makeup a form of beckoning and drawing in. I thought of it at times as a lure. I'm thinking through the structure of desire. It was about consolidation too, of work, of ideas, in order to make sense of patterns and habits and passages of time while being able to expand in place, a very fixed place. Various artworks and people came to the site, which is where I wanted to be and where I wanted conversations to be had. meandering through this opened up and animated archive. Sometimes I imagined the space as a warehouse of ideas, where you could quite physically bump into those ideas and then ricochet off into another and pass through the spaces between these propositions and sense the gravitational weight of the questions I had asked and was asking again. Blake referred to it as a conceptual loading dock, which seems just about right to me. The performances and the works we hung for the performance day were also there to underscore the choreography of it all. Publicly, I would lead a person or groups of people through the spatial arrangements and the recalibrated timelines, moving from zone to zone, passing in front of mirrors or slipping past to avoid them, then disappearing within the interior of oblong box or double-divided facade, or coaxing people from the vastness of the open areas into the cavities of the 3 bathrooms where works were also located. I always moved counterclockwise while guiding these shifting tours, beginning on the lower right of the large room and then spiraling out, widely, then into tighter concentric circles within each zone, and then out again. Privately, I'd work throughout the space, stimulated by the multiplicity of options. I'd slam up against this or that idea, trip over something that would lead me both backward and forward, or gravitate through the space between iterations. I was always taken with Prospect Cottage, Derek Jarman's final home in Dungeness on the south coast of England. I admire the inscriptions he made across the exterior clapboards, making the conceptual and the poetic, the physical and the material. I appreciate the gardens he had there, his pharmacopoeia, as he called it during his illness there, and the recuperative elements of that, and the ever-present maintenance required. And of course, I love the pitch black paint on the compact, chunky form of the house, and the contrasting bright Alio-esque yellow trim. Prospect Cottage and Jarman were among the dense web of inspirations for Torrington, trans-historical blueprints for what could happen there at the intersection of all these scattered points. A practice about space that's not strictly installation, not merely sculptural, not only relational, but about other tendencies, other criteria. I wanted to find a space, to find a physical place to make and arrange work that had a vastness to it, a sort of boundlessness, yet still with clear boundaries in place. Physical, architectural boundaries, but also temporal limitations. I didn't want this to go on indefinitely. Thank you very much.
And now, I guess we can all agree that we have met Tom at bars, clubs, and cafes at some point. So good to know that that counts as a studio visit. Yeah, so we're all contributors in the book, and that's also why it makes sense to bring this presentation to DIA, even though this is a primary information publication. Jordan and I, who work at DIA, have been in long-time conversation with Tom, and I'm going to do kind of like a mini intro. Blake, who's a writer and curator, who's the editor of the book, and his research focuses on contemporary art minimalism and the ways that archival practices challenge fixed narratives of art history. Aria Dean, who's an artist, writer, scholar, and curator, whose work explores blackness, aesthetics, and visibility across visual culture, moving between text, moving image, and installation. Her practice embraces a post-medium approach. And as she pointed in her text, we can all agree that being post-medium, it's okay. Jordan Carter, who's curator and co-department head at DIA, he specializes in fluxes and global conceptual art of the 60s and the 70s. He recently opened a commission with Amy Stillman at DIA Bridgehampton. And last year, we collaborated in a show by Felix Gonzalez Torres at DIA Beacon. I also want to acknowledge that the Torrington Project book has other contributions with different writers and artists like George Baker, Jody Graff, Renee Green, David Joselit, Christine Messineo, Gordon Hall, Nick Mouse, and Maria Hasabi. And we hope that we represent them proudly. So to start with you, Blake, I think your essay, which sort of like introduces the book to the reader, you trace the archival dimension of your relationship with Tom. And with this incredibly beautiful prose, you coin terms like this thematic triangulation of minimalism or historiographic calcification. And I'm wondering if you can speak about this complexity that you unfold in Tom's work and how the book truly extends the spatial conditions of the Torrington Project itself.
Yeah, so I met Tom in my first semester of graduate school. I was writing about an installation that he did in 1995 called 42nd Street Structures, which was at American Fine Arts, which you mentioned earlier. And that exhibition surfaces this kind of, triangulation that you mentioned between sexual counterpublics, particularly the queer sexual counterpublic around Times Square. It's the gentrification that ultimately, eroded that counterpublic under Giuliani era New York, and the way that Tom modeled that process of gentrification through these naked and eroded minimalist sculptures. And so when I was going through and thinking about the history of that work, I was finding all sorts of holes in the archival record, all sorts of inconsistencies and imperfections, but at the same time running up against a secondary literature that seemed very well composed and total and as if it gave a posture of certainty. And by coincidence, this was the period where Tom was also beginning to think about his own archival record. The seeds of Torrington Project were being born at this time. And so we were both coincidentally on this path of thinking about Tom's archive and how to appropriately approach the oddness of one's historical legacy and people's attempts like my own to kind of grapple with it. And so that's been my understanding of Torrington Project the whole time, is that it's a way kind of intervening within the historiographic process that is built up around Tom's work, but anyone's work. Art history is a kind of institutional apparatus like a museum or gallery or anything else, and often goes sort of unacknowledged within that broader context. And so I think the play with his own archive that happened in Torrington Project, where he was able to create new narratives and surface new thematic through lines that people usually don't talk about in relationship to his work, was a way of pushing back at the calcification that often gets put around his work. Things like minimalism, queerness, public space. These are all appropriate terms about Tom's work, right? But they're also can be like very easily wielded without a lot of broader context. And so, just to give like one example of something that I think Torrington Project unfurled is like a lot of these early works that Tom was making dealt with public spaces like beaches and parks, and those have been talked about in relationship to queerness and cruising and like Giuliani era politics, but also like environmentalism, for instance, was like a theme that randomly seemed to come up, or randomly to me at least, seemed to come up through Torrington Project that opened up to me, I think, how Torrington Project operated as a kind of art historical intervention in its own right.
Now, you spent a lot of time in Torrington, obviously, and you experienced many of these restagings and rematerializations of the works with Tom. And in the book, you sort of like elucidate and give some historical context about the kind of like post-studio practice. But as an editor, you had the task to materialize into that condition into a book. So I'm wondering if you can speak about that process of translating this experience and sort of like your memories of it with Tom into a book.
Yeah. Well, on a very basic level, there is a structure to the book. It's not very didactic, and maybe only Tom and I understand what it is. But there was a spatial arrangement in Torrington Project that I think I ultimately think Tom kind of like had this anecdotal structure that where he called certain areas of the space, like the studio or the museum, and then I kind of pushed him to make those more categorical and use them as a logic for breaking up the book. And so that's, on a very basic way, how we kind of mimicked the way Tom would take people through the space is how you, as a reader, are taken through the book, roughly. So that was one way that that experience was translated. But the post-studio element, I think, is done through these odd just disjunctures that happen between documentary photography of the space, and then all of a sudden you are plunged into these archival zoom-ins about particular works, or you are shown photographs of works that were made in Torrington and then shown at a gallery or museum elsewhere. And so even at the very basic level of what is the object of analysis in the book, it becomes somewhat unclear. Torrington Project was in some ways a project of import and export, and that was mimicked in the way that we set up the book.
Now, the process of living through Torrington and to see all these works sort of exist again in space, and also translating those into the book. I wonder how you experience that process now that you have the book in hand and all these ideas that arise as a conversation with Tom for so long are now materialized here. Are there differences? Are there things that you discovered in the sort of printed space?
I mean, I think one thing that's really, and maybe one of the more effective parts of the design, which was done by Garrick Gott, was the way that Tom's text runs throughout the book. And this was largely Tom's idea about how he wanted his text to appear, because the kind of surprises that happened when you walked throughout Torrington, the odd and idiosyncratic encounters with works that you might have recognized, or encounters with new things, or within the photographs that you saw, you might have recognized certain people or whatever it might have been. There's that same spontaneous quality about looking at Tom's text next to certain images, and I think that was a really effective design mechanism that was able to reproduce in some ways the experience of walking through Torrington. So that's, I think, my favorite part of looking through the text now or looking through the book now is Tom's text.
Well, thank you, Blake. Now to move to Aria. Aria, I guess that my first question to you is a bit contextual in terms of your practice. You often interrogate intersections of race, visibility, and form. How did Tom's practice, and particularly what you saw in Torrington, resonated with your thinking?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think really, I guess, through this question of the intersection of, I guess, visibility and form, but I guess rather than visibility, I would say I'm really interested in thinking about the structure of representation. So, not looking at what is seen or how we interpret it so much as sort of in a rather dry way, maybe, how we do representing or how we do these things, which exceeds questions of figuration or the photographic. It's about it is then leads you to the question of form. So I think that's an obvious intersection. And I think for me, I mean, also I've seen many images of Tom's work before, going to Torrington and seen some objects, but then going there and seeing this body of work, I think what you see there is this kind of consistent negotiation of this question, particularly also, I mean, you've already said it better than I could, but this question of, I think you phrase it differential subjectivity. And so if you're an artist who's interested in formalisms or, that history, even the slightest, but you also have some sort of, identity that's coded as specific, the question of form and engaging things at the level of structure becomes a really difficult one to constantly difficult and really rich one to consistently negotiate. So for me, I think that's one thing that I felt connected to, I guess, in that, and as well, I guess, and in terms of structures of representation as well, and not purely thinking about it like through the image. I think sculpture, and of course sculpture is a contested term, and I was post medium is okay. But I think like also being, if you're an artist who's interested in form and material, but you're also see yourself as existing within the conceptual art lineage, and you're dealing with the question of identity, how does this sort of then self-reflexively come through the work? And I think for me there was a lot to think about with regard to that. But I mean, really just this question of formalism and a sort of after identity politics maybe would be a way of framing it. But.
Now, there, I love that your kind of like language really mimics how you speak, and it's incredibly entertaining also to read. And you deployed a question which I think was not only beautiful but super important. You said, at what point does a thing cease to be itself? And you're kind of like elucidating about notions of permanence, and you also bring up this idea of metabolizing an object, and in this case obviously an artwork. And I'm wondering if you can further reflect about how specifically your contribution in the book, which is titled Factuals, is problematizing the life and value of objects.
Mm-hmm. I'm laughing. I'm so bad at titling. I think I was like, I don't care what you guys call it. But I mean, I think so. I guess some backstory, and it's like the text includes this. But yeah, I went to Torrington in August, last summer, I guess it was. Yeah. And at the time, I had this like literally the text opens with this sort of anecdote about this ongoing problem I had, which probably I shouldn't be talking about publicly. But but I had this. There was a work that I'd made that had like twice over something had happened to it, like the materiality, it kind of had been deteriorating in transit, like it got sent twice to the place it was supposed to end up in. Both times this very weird chemical process, something happened, and no one could really figure out what was going on. And so I was kind of in my own practice preoccupied with this question of like, also for me, being interested in, again, like I guess, being somewhat post-studio, post-medium, dealing sort of with work conceptually, but also ending up making work that is quite material when I'm like after noodling around in those concepts. I just don't particularly like the idea of the object itself being the work and being unique and needing to be taken care of is not necessarily always the way that I've worked. But this object was falling apart, and so I was kind of being asked to think about that. And I don't know, and it was stressful for practical reasons, but also these works that I was making were involved like a digital process. So also just fundamentally in the work there was baked in this question of like, is it even like, is the thing really actually the thing, which I get interested in philosophically. So then going to Torrington and being going around through all the works with Tom, it was like an intensely emotional experience, because it was actually this like mobilization of this question and like a navigation of it that felt like incredibly like soothing almost. It's a really weird word, and I don't think I even like got to really like say this to you like in full, but so then the text looks at this and tries to think it through in more philosophical terms, and sort of asking like, okay, so if you're a conceptual artist who also is making works that are either viewed as sculptural or draw on histories of like minimalist sculpture, post-minimalism, and I wrote particularly about the Sarah kind of impersonation. I really also like that, the language of impersonation. So then thinking about the question of time and the work, and I basically began to argue in it that maybe like these works put together in this space end up, and this is me rephrasing it now, I think kind of, I didn't say it this way, but with some distance, like that they kind of have their own time or something. So together they kind of are operating like, there's this diachronic, like, okay, yes, like, a series of works over the course of a career, but also, and even in the way that you're titling things, sometimes they kind of end up occupying multiple, time spaces together. So, and I guess then it made me think too about like this idea that, so it's not just a conceptual work. It doesn't not matter the materiality of it, but it's kind of constantly being tended to. And so the artist then stops being, the creator of this like work, and all those romantic ideas, but the artist is tending to this sort of like, sometimes literally a garden. And I'll stop talking soon, but I wrote down some notes because I was thinking about it today, and also just again with some new tools in hand, like yeah, this idea that there's just like, it's basically just a recursivity that, right, it's a sort of model of time that's not just linear. We're kind of curly queuing through periods of your practice, and then you can kind of look at a thing, freeze it in time, and also relate it to these other like points in something that's more like a diagram or a cubic kind of like model of time or something. And then it also made me think about, the studio visit as a concept. I think I was also trying to write about, like, I think embedded in that text, right, is like art without experience, or art without the apparatus that like requires it to be like an individual object that then is assigned a value, or even just something that we have a sense of the aesthetic value of, right? Like sort of these objects all together in this space. It's almost got this like night at the museum kind of element to it, or like Fantasia or something. Like these things are now relating to each other at this sort of horizontalized level that allows them to. And I think I phrase it as like they're not necessarily, it's not like they're living or, or changing in like an algorithmic sense or something. They're just kind of have this like, again, their own time that they're operating in together, so.
Yeah, I was also fascinated at the way that you kind of like summon the word cannibalism, right? Because you're thinking about a kind of like an embodied process of something becoming other, and sort of like syncretism that sort of like made me think about the show that Tom had in Brazil, and this dialogue with Oiticica, and the cannibalistic manifesto of Oswald Andrade, and this idea of how to produce a new cultural entity through the embodied experience of metabolizing something. And in this case, you were thinking very specifically about material decay, whereas in the space, there were things that were being reconstituted in a way. So, the creation, destruction in this context had a very specific historical meaning, and I really enjoyed how you brought that really in a really subtle way to the discussion.
Thanks. Yeah. I just say if I guess I sort of comment on that. I guess like, yeah, the reconstitute. I think. Even today when talking about again impersonating like a Judd or something, right? There's sort of like that kind of like metabolize, digesting it, and then like it's just I don't know, mixed metaphor, I suppose. but that then like does that also on a conceptual level, like does that make it something new? And I think for myself as well in my practice, like I get really interested in like certain artists of that period and like taking it in and then like popping it back out. And so like it kind of it sort of shifts the focus towards like the work in this network, even beyond just one practice, right? And so it's kind of like and then it's almost like sort of the annoying like McLuhan-esque thing, like what is like we're like the organs for the reproduction of technology or something, right? It's like then like being the organs of art's reproduction of itself across these things. But yeah.
Thank you, Aria. Now, Jordan, you and I have, for obvious reasons and our proximity, an incredibly close relationship, and we know each other pretty well and have ongoing conversations about many programmatic aspects at DIA. And I know that for you, something that's really important about your practice, and again, kind of like to situate your practice as a curator at DIA and beyond, you really deem this idea of sustained engagement and durational practices as something that I think both informs your practice as a curator and the work you do here at DIA. So I'm wondering if you can elaborate more about how these ideas manifest in your practice.
Thank you, Humberto. Of course, one of the things that really drew me to DIA in the first place was this ethos grounded in its mission around sustained engagements and a very radically durational mode of stewardship. Thinking about the early years of DIA and sort of this small cadre of artists that DIA worked with towards really facilitating these otherwise inconceivable visions. But thinking about that more practically as it relates to my own values and practice, I really don't believe in this idea of one-off engagements or this more transactional approach to making an exhibition and that being sort of the final product or sort of the end result of a dialogue. Rather, it can often be the beginning and really the impetus for a multi-year ongoing dialogue that can have various different public manifestations or articulations over time. So it's really a privilege to be able to collaborate with artists in different institutional contexts, different roles, and really be able to follow the arc of their practice and find sort of meaningful or relevant intersections that allow these dialogues to meet a public in a different moment. I would say most recently, an example of this would be the exhibition On View, The Equator Has Moved, of Renee Green at DIA Beacon, that actually has its origins before my time at DIA, and conversations around an acquisition of her work during my time at the Art Institute. So being able to find, the appropriate context, the appropriate moment to be able to really initiate a project in a significant and meaningful way can actually be the result of a dialogue that's been going on for several years versus something that can be more opportunistic, you could say, in terms of programmatic development. I think the same is true of Tom, of course, who we first collaborated 10 years ago when I was a junior curator, a curatorial fellow at the Walker Art Center, working on a commission for an exhibition called Question the Wall Itself that loosely engaged sort of the politics of constructed interior scenes, sort of coming off of the genealogy of Marcel Brotars and the idea of esprit de corps. And from then on, we had many different dialogues to this day, including an acquisition and a reciting of a work that I write about in the contribution, The Railings, May 1970 from 2017, that was acquired by the Art Institute of Chicago and positioned in the North Garden there. We've had several, dialogues publicly like this, and actually just returned from Austria and Graz, where I had the opportunity to see his most recent exhibition, Paul, which actually speaks a lot to my entry in the catalog, where he's taken this idea of Pier Paolo Pasolini's screenplay, our unrealized screenplay, St. Paul, that sort of unfolds as this episodic, peripatetic narrative, and taking it as sort of a model or a methodology for creating what will be an intentionally episodic and nomadic exhibition. And we're actually collaborating towards a new commission for St. Louis, my hometown. And I really actually like this sort of serendipitous or sort of contingent intersections between the personal and the institutional roles that we play in curator-artist relationships. And so we'll be launching a new commission, new public outdoor commission next fall as part of Counterpublic.
Now, in your essay, which is titled Desire Lines, you kind of like dive into the fugitive nature of Tom's queer politics, but in relationship to his site-specific practice. And I think, your essay within the book sits as sort of like a Russian doll, which is speaking about spatial practices in a spatial device. So I'm wondering if you can reflect on this layered genealogy of site and what you hope to achieve with the text.
One thing that Tom and I have talked about and that I wanted to reflect on in this text is his, sort of iterative approach to site, really engaging with ideas of site specificity, again, seeing site not as a destination or a fixed coordinate, but perhaps as a point of departure. So the ways in which his site-specific works often are born out of, say, the architectural conditions, behavior, certain histories of a particular location, but they're not bound by them, and they actually accrue new meaning as they begin to, as I say, cruise, or sort of have these different institutional or exhibition context encounters that become constitutive to their meaning. So this idea of sites cruising, or thinking about cruising or encounter as sort of a heuristic or a logic for understanding the approach to site, is something that I wanted to draw out and achieve in this text. And as you say, it is quite nested in the sense that I think the book itself and its architecture are intentionally nonlinear and sort of reflect this idea as the reader cruises through the book and encounters, a work. You actually encounter the text. There is no table of contents, so you're kind of meandering and you sort of find, there's Aria Dean. But also the work sort of, you see them in one image at one time, at another moment. So there's these encounters, these returns, these partial glances, partial views, moments of recognition, moments of alienation, which also make you think a little bit about Tom in Torrington sort of meandering within his own corpus, within his own body of work, over the course of the years that he was occupying this space and beginning to think about what could it mean to cruise within one's own biography, within one's own output, I think is an interesting or provocative way of thinking about how he relates to sight, but also how this book itself becomes a site in its own right.
Thank you, Jordan. Well, I want to open up for all of you in case you have any questions for each other or for me.
Well, Humberto, now that you ask, I do have a question for you because in addition to being the moderator of this talk, you also contributed to the book. And, you know, Tom, as both an artist and a writer, I think often, you know, expresses a poetic sensibility, but also mobilizes, you know, a citational method, citing others, but often even citing himself in a recursive manner. And I feel like your text definitely is perhaps inspired by some of these techniques, or maybe takes them into your own sort of voice and method. So maybe you could elaborate a bit on that.
Yeah, I guess that, I mean, kind of like in the same way, my relationship with Tom has sort of like the same genesis. And I was just thinking about what you were saying, Patrick, because Blake, because the minute the American Fine Arts Archive became available almost more than a decade ago, it opened the possibility for a generation to really dive into what happened in the early 90s. And, you know, I was doing a lot of research about John Knight and Tom at that time. And that's how I got to Tom almost 15 years ago. And, you know, in a way to discover the questions that were being asked by those gallery formats, Pat Hearn, Colin, etc., sort of like establish a durational relationship. Tom and I did a show at the SCAD Museum of Art where I used to work, and that show was titled Sedimental, which is a word that Tom invented. It was a mix of sediment and sentimental, and we did a small publication which was basically a dialogue between Tom and myself. And, you know, there has been a dialectic relationship with Tom. So when you guys invited me to contribute to this book, I really thought that I should honor that relationship. And I also like to go to the spaces that are allegedly prohibited to curators. So I often, you know, write poetry and publish poetry, or, you know, I go to literary formats that are unconventional because I enjoy writing them. So I decided to write this sort of like two-voice sort of poem, which, as you say, Jordan, is kind of like summoning different voices that are important to Tom, to me, Susan Sontag, Elio Tizica, Felix Gonzalez Torres, David Boynerovics, but also, you know, interlocutors that Tom has had in other moments and in other projects. And it was kind of like thinking, how could a dialogue between my own voice and all this sort of like pantheon of voices that existed in my head when I was thinking about Tom's work. And I wanna read just like a tiny little piece of my voice in one of the parts of the text, but it says, a forensic exploration of objects outside of time, unearthing the overburden, the burdens, excavating what is left in form to reveal what is possible in meaning by approximating what cannot be grasped. Making sense of the mise-en-scene, a screen that holds no image, which reflects no light, but only stands for what once was. An operational dexterity, result of a sentimental procedures placed almost too long ago, repeated one after the other, on top of each other, accumulating, blending, bending, from the dematerialization of art to the materialization of thought via the reconfiguration of space. Sculpture? No, but the feeling of it. An oscillation between the end of language and the beginning of an object. So these ideas are ideas that I've been discussing with Tom for many years, and, you know, the way of materializing those, we're really into quotes from Secret Poetics from Oiticica, or The Weight of the World from Buenarobics, and these voices that I feel resonate so profoundly with Tom's practice. So yeah, that is what the contribution ended up being.
Blake, I wanted to ask you if you could talk a bit about the process of, I guess, first selecting like who you wanted to work with, and I guess and with Tom as well, like who you wanted to have contribute, and the process of commissioning, editing, etc.
Yeah, I mean, this also, I just want to, in talking about the kind of litany of voices that are a part of this book, I'm remembering an anecdote that, Humberto, that you had a few years ago, where you said that you wanted to make a book one day called Burr and His Boys. And we sort of exceeded that goal because they're non-men who are writing in the book, but I just wanted to sort of throw that out there, is that maybe this partially accomplishes that goal.
It was Burr's Boys.
Burr's Boys, okay. So there was a possessive. Anyway, so how did we choose the writers? So, well, there were a few that had engaged really, intensely over a period of, years, decades with Tom's work, including Jordan, including Humberto, including George Baker, David Joslet, and Jody Graff. These are people who, came to mind right away as people we wanted to write again about Tom's work. And also, these are people that had written or curated exhibitions about Tom over the course of many years, over the course of Tom's career. Like George Baker, for instance, wrote some of the first really important scholarship about Tom's work in the early 2000s, and I'm on stage with two people that have curated very important things related to Tom of his more recent work, and so that chronological span was important for something like Torrington Project, which of course is like an archive of his entire practice. Aria was someone we were both interested in for many of the reasons that you actually already talked about. I think the question of artistic practice was something that we were interested in you responding to in Torrington Project, because in some ways it's such a manifesto around questions of storage and autonomy from galleries, and how does one live within the commercial ecosystem, and Tom is reflecting on that through Torrington Project at one stage in his career, and we both thought it'd be very interesting for you to reflect on that from another stage in your career. And then of course there's this twinned formal relationship between minimalism and identity politics that you talked about as well. But I think that artistic practice was why we wanted to ask you to write. Christine Massinio is another writer in the book who was totally essential. She was the first interlocutor with Tom when he started working on Torrington Project. She was, in the archives with him, looking up where works existed. She was finding works and bringing them back to the space. She was, really in the weeds and did a lot of the legwork that I didn't have to do thanks to her. So we really needed Christine to write. And then Renee was another person who I think we both felt really immediately that needed to be in the book, because this question around the problems around historicization, a lot of the kind of conceptual ready-made that Tom has been subjected to, Renee has as well. I think both of them have a lot of ambivalence towards the term institutional critique, but it's something I think maybe they both begrudgingly accept. Both of them are related to Pat Hearn and American Fine Arts Gallery. So there are these things that they both contend with, and Renee herself has written very eloquently and critically about the kind of confines that art history can put up around an artist and their work. And so she came straight to mind as well. And then I guess I wrote, but I sort of had to. So.
But I think there's some also the spectral contributors who are not maybe contributing texts, but show up by way of documentation of the performances that occurred as sort of the denouement of the Torrington Project. Nick Mouse, Gordon Hall, Maria Hasabi. And what I found interesting about this quasi-public performance in which was for a limited audience, is that in many ways they were performances meant for publication, that there's sort of the specificity to this book in terms of that is the way in which one engages the performance. And maybe you could elaborate a little bit more about that choreography in relationship to creating the book.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you flip through the book, you'll see photos, and encounter a text all of a sudden. And so there's this kind of lack of hierarchization between documentation and the interpretation of Tom's work. And you'll encounter the performances as one such like chapter of the book. It's not announced, you happen upon it. It's not in the middle, it's kind of towards the end, like 3/4 towards the end maybe. And so in a way we wanted to frame it in the book as, not a textual contribution per se, but kind of on the same level or whatever, that Nick, Gordon, and Maria were all responding to the space like the writers were responding to the space, and we didn't want to differentiate those responses any more than they already do based on the forms that they take, which are very obvious because some are performances and some are words. But I think what arose afterwards, which was really interesting after seeing the performances actually happen, was that there were these really eerie and fascinating relationships between Tom's work at Torrington and the performances. So Gordon gave this incredible performative lecture around Scott Burton. So there was both, these questions around queer minimalism, kind of a queer minimal forefather that was in the room, but also so much of Burton's work is about hosting, it's about, seats. And, I think that's one way that Tom had thought about Torrington, was a place of kind of performative hosting. Maria's extremely slow posed choreographies related to, if anyone saw Tom's show at Bortolami a few years ago, this series of photographs called Capricornus, so both her performance and those photographs deal with this kind of very low-grade, zero-degree movements and how those still extract a sort of performativity. And then I think maybe Nick's, even the most, he used just the screenplay by Genet Adam Miroir, which uses mirrors and self-reflection as one of its central motifs. And self-reflection, I think, is maybe the primary motivating logic in a way of Torrington Project. Maybe not, but it's in there. And Tom walking through his own work and is in a way walking through a hall of mirrors. So that was a really beautiful series of relationships between the performances and Torrington Project that I don't think we accounted for when we asked them to participate.
Well, just be mindful of time and to move towards the book signing. Thank you, Blake. Thank you, Aria. Thank you, Jordan. Thank you, Tom. And we'll move to your book signing. Thank you, everyone, for coming.